This video focuses on the early life of mathematician Mary Somerville, who came to be known as the Queen of 19th century science. Mary grew up in Burntisland, Scotland, which is easily accessible from Edinburgh by car or train. During my first visit in 2016, I took a train from Waverley Station, Edinburgh. The trip takes about half an hour and crosses over the Firth of Forth on the Forth Rail Bridge. I was eager to get to Burnt Island, but I was also excited to be traveling across the bridge, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site and very interesting in its own right. After crossing the Firth and arriving at the Burnt Island station, it's an easy walk to the center of town. I had researched the address of Mary's childhood home before leaving, but then I forgot to bring it with me. So by way of a travel tip, if you hope to see a specific location on your travels, I recommend bringing the information with you. Thankfully, in this instance, there was a display in the middle of town that was very helpful, and on which Mary Somerville was prominently displayed. It turns out that I'd walked past her house on my short stroll to the town center, so it was no big deal to turn around and go back a block or so. Her home is the White House partway down this street, a street that now bears her name. I was pretty excited to be here, so I took a lot of pictures of her house. Hers is the house with door frames painted gray, not the house with the red door here. Mary used to look at the stars out her window at night, and this was one inspiration for her that spurred her on toward learning astronomy and mathematics. Above the front door of her childhood home is a plaque honoring her as the well-known mathematician and astronomer that she became. Here is the back of the house, and here's another picture of the house from my trip in 2022 when the weather was a bit nicer. My next stop was the nearby beach and tide pools, where she spent a lot of time as a child. Observing wildlife here was another early inspiration that kindled her interest in learning about science. After spending some time in the tide pools, I headed over to the beach. It's always my goal to walk in the footsteps of mathematicians who have inspired me. And as a California girl, I was especially happy to be walking in the footsteps of this mathematician. Looking across the Firth from Burnt Island Beach, Edinburgh, with its very recognizable landmarks such as Arthur's Seat, Salisbury Crags, Calton Hill, and Edinburgh Castle, is easily visible, and especially so on a clearer day than the one I had during my first visit here. Between the beach and the town is a public green space known as the Links. Notice that you can still see the distinctive Edinburgh landmarks across the Firth or bay. I circled the Links on my way back into town and on toward Mary's childhood church. Burnt Island Parish Kirk, or church, is just up the street and around the corner from Mary's house, just 1 block away. This church was already 200 years old when Mary was born. It has a tremendously rich history, which I was going to include here, but will create a separate video for instead. Not just for the church history, but for the impact on Mary of spending a childhood so centered in this church community. Once that video is ready, I'll post a link in the description below, and I'll put a link above in the video as well. Just 2 blocks from the church is the Borough Chambers, that has a small but very informative museum on the first floor. If you visit Burnt Island, I recommend stopping in there. I was particularly interested in travel across the Firth, knowing that Mary's family spent some time each year in their home in Edinburgh. This was before bridges had been built over the Firth, so they had to take a ferry. Storms can get quite rough over these waters, and Mary's mother was terrified every time they crossed the Firth. There's some good information here about what those crossings were like. Thankfully, there are bridges today. And on my second trip to Burnt Island, I got to travel by car thanks to my Tours-by-Locals guide, Toby. I found this new car bridge to be beautiful, just in a different way from the rail bridge. There are actually 3 bridges in close proximity, but photos from a moving car or moving airplane don't do these bridges justice. It's truly beautiful here. And now, making an abrupt transition, we're back in Edinburgh, and I want to talk about another of Mary's inspirations, and that was her art teacher, Alexander Naismith. Mary was already interested in learning mathematics, but she wasn't allowed to do so. It wasn't considered proper in her day, and women were considered too fragile mentally to be able to take that on. But one day she overheard her art instructor talking with a group of boys about how if they wanted to understand perspective, they should read Euclid. Mary tucked this piece of information away, hoping someday to be able to study Euclid. At least now she knew where to begin. Naismith is known for his landscapes, but as a favor to his friend Robert Burns, he painted this portrait to be used on the title page of a book of his poetry. If you've been watching my math travel videos, you know that I leave no stone unturned, no matter how tangential. So as well as seeking out Naismith's paintings, I also visited his grave. This is in the kirkyard of St. Cuthbert's Kirk. The kirk and kirkyard stand in the shadow of Edinburgh Castle, something that would have been a very familiar sight to Mary Somerville. So Naismith, in that overheard comment, gave Mary a bit of what she needed for such a time as she might have freedom to study mathematics. Later in life, that time finally did come about. Unfortunately, it was after her first husband died. As a widow, with a little bit of an inheritance, she was at a respectable stage of her life and able to make her own decisions. And her decision was to dive as deeply as possible into mathematics. One person who helped her was John Playfair, who was a professor of natural philosophy at the University of Edinburgh. He assisted her in seeking out the books that would be most helpful. He was a pretty big deal, and this is a monument to him on Calton Hill in Edinburgh near the observatory. His grave is just across the way in Old Calton Burial Ground. As with seeking out houses, it's a good idea to have your information with you when seeking out graves. John Playfair's is just behind the huge round memorial to David Hume. The light wasn't cooperating, so for better or for worse, I tried to provide some shade with my hands. I'm including this in the video on Mary Somerville, but I'm also interested in John Playfair as a mathematician in his own right, which is part of the reason for my visit to his monument and his grave. But now onward to Edinburgh's New Town. It's beautiful New Town. Mary's family had a home on Northumberland Street. The house number is 53. And as in Burnt Island, there is also a plaque commemorating the fact that Mary Fairfax Somerville lived here. Mary Fairfax Somerville, the queen of 19th century science, astronomer, scientist, and polymath. This is an astounding accomplishment for a girl who was not allowed to study math or science as a child or young woman, but who never lost sight of her dream, and who from humble beginnings overcame obstacles to rise to the heights of her field.